from balmy Chicago. How's it going? I just thought I'd have a little bit of fun with my background here. Without further ado, let's get started. Last time we looked at public art and censorship and the role of commissions, public response, and controversy. This week we're taking it to the streets. And talking about murals, street art, graffiti art, and guerrilla art. We'll define these different terms along the way and see how these different forms of art intersect with one another, and how they intersect with politics and social activism. Street art is a bit of an umbrella term. It covers a wide range of mediums. So yes, it could include some graffiti, and it would include work by someone like Banksy, but it would also include Jenny Holzer's text-based work with provocative truisms, or it would include Gordon Maddock Clark's interventions in abandoned buildings in New York in the early 1970s. Murals on building exteriors are one form of sanctioned street art, usually commissioned. A mural is any piece of artwork painted or applied directly onto a wall, ceiling, or other permanent surface, so that's a pretty broad term as well. Here we're looking at the subject of both of our readings for the week, the famous collaborative mural known as the Wall of Respect, created by the Organization for Black American Culture, or OBAC. It was created in 1967, but destroyed when the building burned down in 1971. The mural features portraits by a number of famous Black Americans, divided into different categories: statesmen, such as Malcolm X; athletes, like Muhammad Ali; rhythm and blues, Aretha Franklin; religion, Nat Turner; literature, Gwendolyn Brooks; theater, Cicely Tyson; and jazz, like Miles Davis. Artists worked on each section in their own unique style. We read a chapter by Setu Jones, who is not only a writer, but also a working artist. He wrote a little bit about the Wall of Respect and its impact on him when he saw it. I really liked how he concluded his essay, stating, "Art takes many forms and has many functions in a community. It reflects our values and dreams, and as our society is changing around us, it is changing, growing, and evolving." The original Wall of Respect inspired a huge mural movement in Chicago and beyond. We have since seen a number of plays on the Wall of Respect, not only in Chicago, but in other cities across the US. In recent years, in light of the Black Lives Matter movement, we've seen a resurgence in this again, and here are a few examples from 2016. Graffiti art has its origins in 1970s New York, when young people began to use spray paint and other materials to create images on buildings and on the sides of subway trains. Such graffiti can range from bright graphic images to the stylized monograms that we see here. Even though it's widespread and part of the visual culture in most large cities, graffiti is also illegal in most places. The image on the lower right shows a subway car in New York that was tagged by some Spanish tourists in 2018 who claimed that they didn't know it was illegal because in Spain, it is normal. P.S. If you're into graffiti, you should really check out the movie Style Wars if you haven't already. New York in the 1970s was kind of a city in chaos. Many parts of the city were in such awful states that landlords were purposely committing arson to collect on insurance. In total, over 40% of the South Bronx was burned or abandoned between 1970 and 1980. I just want to dwell on that figure for a second. 40% of the South Bronx was burned or abandoned between 1970 and 1980. Buildings were abandoned and became the perfect site for illegal activity. But artists also saw an opportunity to say something about this situation and draw attention to the poverty and crime damaging their communities. John Fechner was the artist who created this graffiti piece using stencils and paint. This was in an area of the South Bronx known as Charlotte Street. And this was one of the worst areas. It basically looked like it had been bombed out during a war. Broken Promises is meant to call attention to inadequate housing, poor services, and the deplorable social problems that had afflicted the neighborhood for the past 2 decades. On August 5, 1980, presidential candidate Ronald Reagan stood amidst the ruins promising to rebuild the area, as did his predecessor, President Jimmy Carter, on October 5, 1977, in order to court the African American vote.
President Carter will be in New York today to address the convention of the National Urban League. In remarks prepared for delivery there, Mr. Carter says that he will propose a program shortly which will ensure that equal opportunity means equal economic opportunity for the disadvantaged. Mr. Carter isn't the only candidate to court the Urban League and the black vote. Ronald Reagan is doing it too, as Derek Blakely reports.
The day-long effort to court the black vote began in New York before the National Urban League, where Reagan appealed to skeptical delegates to look beyond his conservative label and add his proposals for job and urban revitalization. To demonstrate his concern, the Republican nominee traveled to the South Bronx, where rampant urban blight has left dozens of city blocks a virtual wasteland. In a shouting match with residents, many of whom demanded jobs, Reagan replied, "I can't do a damn thing for you if I don't get elected."
Is there more jobs coming through the Bronx?
I am going to try as hard as I can. All I can tell you is that I'm going to try to bring that about, and not with the kind of a promise that Carter made.
Probably some of the most famous graffiti artists would be Basquiat and Keith Haring, two New York-based artists who passed away at very young ages. Basquiat was known by the name Samo, which stood for same old shit. He would leave text-based graffiti and some cartoon-like drawings on the streets and in the subway, much like Haring, who was known for his faceless, genderless figures who always seemed to be radiating energy. One of Haring's early commissioned works was on a giant wall in Lower Manhattan, on the corner of Houston Street and the Bowery. Ironically, although he was known for his illegal graffiti work, his own piece was vandalized. As he said, "The first few times it was defaced, I was personally hurt by it. I realized, of course, that when you put something in public that is in a certain way a gift, and if you do it in public and leave it, it's vulnerable to whatever is going to happen to it from the outside world." That's really a shift from Richard Serra's statement that art is not democratic. And by the way, this wall is still used to commission public art to this day. Guerrilla art is a street art movement that owes much to the early graffiti movement. It's sometimes called post-graffiti art. It first emerged in the UK, but has since spread across the world and is now established in most countries that already have developed graffiti scenes. Here we're looking at a few different examples of guerrilla art. Again, Banksy, but also an example of yarn bombing in London. That's when somebody crochets or knits colorful yarn onto objects or architecture in usually large metropolitan areas, covering lampposts, trees, chain link fences, and other things in yarn. We also see a recent installation that popped up in New York City last year, in response to the border crisis and the Trump administration's detainment of children. In each case, this guerrilla work pops up usually overnight. It is unsolicited and unsanctioned, and it can either be highly political in nature or totally for aesthetic purposes. Rage Flower Thrower is probably the most famous piece by Banksy. It's located in Palestine, an area prone to conflict and war. It shows a guy dressed in what we would consider riot clothing, although he's not throwing a bomb, but a bouquet of flowers. Typical of Banksy's work, it's mostly in black and white, but with a pop of color. In this case, he puts the flowers in color as if to highlight their beauty in an otherwise kind of bleak world, and likely to emphasize their symbolism as a sign of peace. You can see that it's actually a stencil that he's used. The idea is that he can go in quickly and make the image so as not to draw any attention. Part of his shtick is that he's anonymous, in part because what he's doing is technically illegal in most places. Ironic, considering he's one of the most highly coveted artists working today. All right, so next week, originally we had plans to go visit the Pilsen murals in person. So instead, we're gonna take a virtual field trip and check out some of those murals. So most of what we're doing next week will take place on the discussion board. All right, so I hope you all have a good week. I'm gonna go back to drinking my pina coladas, and I will see you next week. Take care.